Hello friends, for today's video I'm going to be doing a book unhaul. Most of the books on this list I'll be taking into my local bookstores. I might sell some of these on Pango as some of them are special editions, but for the very first one on the list I'll be donating it to my local library, and that would be Starling House. The reason I'll be donating this one is because this is an ARC copy and I personally don't feel comfortable receiving money, even if it's just in the form of store credits. I just don't feel comfortable trying to take it into a bookstore, and then I don't feel comfortable trying to sell it on Pango because even if I were to try and put in the description somewhere that it's an ARC copy, it looks so much like a finished copy that I wouldn't want somebody to get it and be expecting the final version. Even though I read this via immersion reading, meaning I read the physical copy and listened to the audiobook, by the time I got around to this, the audiobook was out and it was associated with the final version of the book. So in doing immersion reading, I was able to catch the couple of times that there was different word usage, but honestly, this was essentially identical to the final version. There's just those couple of times where the words were different or a word was cut. Usually it was a curse word, which I found kind of funny because the final version still had cursing in it. So I thought it was interesting that they cut a couple of them. Regardless, that's irrelevant. This is a book that I recently talked about in a new fantasy releases wrap-up, and I did a dedicated reading vlog for it over on my Patreon. So if you're interested in those, I'll have my Patreon and that new fantasy releases wrap-up linked. But the setup for the story is that you follow this young woman who is living in basically our world, and there is this small town that has had this mysterious house known as Starling House, sort of just always off in the corner being odd, and they have a lot of rumors about the house. There's a lot to do with stories and intergenerational trauma and the way in which people perceive things based off of who's telling the story and what is the actual truth of it. I liked those themes of the story. I did wish that it was a little bit leaning into its creepy house a little more, because that's kind of the thing I was expecting to get a little more from this book. I still thought it was well written and I could see this working for a lot of people. Just ultimately didn't really work for me, but there's nothing about it that I absolutely hated. And I'll add, it had a great sibling bond, which I think was probably the strongest aspect of the story. So anyway, because it's an ARC, like I said, taking it in and donating it to my local library. Next up, we have a book where I was considering rereading this series, and when I say rereading, I mean picking the first book up and trying again. And I had DNF'd it previously. Nothing wrong with it necessarily. I just found I wasn't quite engaged with the politicking. I didn't really find I liked... It's not that I disliked the characters. I just didn't find myself really caring what happened to them, which is kind of not what you want with your stories. And I know this is the silliest of things, but and this wasn't why I DNF'd the story, but there's something to do with the magic that kind of causes plants essentially to grow in and out of people, and that really disturbs me. It's one of those things where I'm like, oh no. I have a few phobias. I have an eye phobia, so I can't wear contacts because it really disturbs me. Also, I don't like collections of tiny holes. I forget what that's called, but that's a big no for me. And I'm discovering I don't know if there's a name for it, but I really don't like plants growing out of areas where they're not supposed to. I don't know if that's a thing, but the fact that it was a thing in this book, especially coming out of people, it's like a disease in the story. I just was like, I don't like this. And I know it's dumb. Anyway, you're probably wondering, you're like, what the heck even is the story? And for those of you that have read it, you've probably figured it out. But anyway, the book would be The Jasmine Throne is the first one. I picked this one up because I actually found it on sale at my local bookstore for, I think, under $10. It's a hardback and it's a special edition. So I was like, oh, well, I was thinking about trying that series out again. So here's the second one. Maybe I can pick this first one up, then jump into the second. But I've just found that the more I think about it, the more that I just don't know if this is one that I want to come back to, at least not anytime in upcoming months. So better that somebody who really likes the series finds this special edition and then they can add it to their shelves rather than me just sitting on it and contemplating if I even want to pick it up. I figure if I do want to pick it up at some point, I can always check it out from the library. This next one will probably come as no surprise to anybody, and that would be Fourth Wing, and also its sequel, Iron Flame. Both of these are, well, I guess they're both first printings. I think that they, I think there was maybe more printings of Iron Flame with the sprayed edges. This one, though, I couldn't believe, this was just at a Barnes & Noble before its release date, and I saw it, and I was like, oh, I've seen, because it was on anticipated releases, and I was like, oh, well, I've seen a lot of praise for it, early praise, so I guess I'll give it a go. And I picked it up. I didn't realize it was going to be the sensation that it became, and I also was not expecting this copy to start selling for, I think I've seen it for hundreds of dollars online, so I'm like, oh man, I'm not, one, going to sell it for hundreds of dollars, so if somebody really wants it, then they'll find it cheaper on my Pango account. But I just feel bad. I don't really care for this series, and there's no reason for me to have it. I just happen to have not gotten around to putting it up for sale. I think what I'm going to do is put this one and Iron Flame as sort of like a package deal, and just because I wanted to support this one company, there was a company that made an alternative dust jacket for this, and it's really beautiful, so maybe I'll sell these two together with the alternative jacket also. And like I said, it'll probably be cheaper for all of those things than it would be to buy it for, you know, hundreds of dollars or whatever the amount is that it's going for. Next up, we have some Book of the Month books. My local used bookstore, Bookman's, it definitely takes Book of the Month books. I see them there all the time. I know one of my used bookstores, pretty much they never take them, but that is irrelevant. The books themselves, we have The Unmaking of June Farrow, and I read this one. It was fine. I don't know what it is. I like this author's writing. I guess the better way to put it is I feel like I should like this author's writing. There's nothing I find wrong with it. I don't dislike the way that the story is told. I just never come away really gripped, really gutted, really thinking like, oh wow, that was so bittersweet. Even though I feel like on surface, when I talk about the books in, you know, new releases wrap-ups or just wrap-ups or whenever I talk about the books, it always feels like I should like them when I describe them. But thus far, this author's books have just not really clicked with me. It's one of those authors, though, where I by no means think the book was bad. And it's not one of those things where it's like, I would recommend it even though I really didn't like Fourth Wing, that was not going to work for me. Meaning I picked it up hoping it would, and then very quickly I'm like, no. This, though, I mean, I read the whole thing, and it follows this woman. It actually, I've compared it to Starling House. I've compared the two to each other. But it follows this woman who there's this curse, essentially, in her family where the women are going to lose their sanity. And our main character is discovering that she's starting to experience this, but she doesn't want to tell anybody because everybody in this small town knows this is a thing, this is an affliction, and that she doesn't want everybody to start looking at her different, treating her different. She wants to hold on to the normalcy of her life for as long as possible, so she's kind of trying to keep it hidden, but she can't really ignore it because at some point it starts to really affect her life, and then all of a sudden everything gets turned upside down. And it was interesting. I found aspects of it compelling. I don't know what it is. It's one of the only authors that I've tried 3 books from now, and every time I'm like, I want to anyway, I don't need to keep going about that. I'm taking that book in, likely to Bookman's. The next one would be Tomorrow, and Tomorrow, and Tomorrow. So I'm not going to give a whole rundown about anything going on with this book, but a very brief reason why I'm not keeping it is I had heard rumblings about this book taking maybe a little too much inspiration from somebody else's work, and I looked into it, and for me personally, I do think it crossed a line, and it didn't credit the person, even though it wasn't being denied after the, I guess you could say, accusations came forth. It wasn't denied that it was taking inspiration from this other individual's work. They just essentially said, yeah, but this other thing isn't the same medium, so they don't need to give credit, and I disagree with that concept. So that's a a general rundown as to why I'm getting rid of this. Don't feel the need to pick it up. I'm all good. Next up, my Book of the Month edition of Ruthless Vows. I did end up getting just the regular edition to match the hardback edition that I had gotten from before of the first one. So I just don't really need this copy. I might have actually gotten also the Barnes & Noble exclusive of Ruthless Vows because I really like that duology. And also I just find that the Barnes & Noble one, I just think it goes nicely color-wise as opposed to going black and then white. I kind of like the two darker colors together. So anyway, I loved Ruthless Vows, though I'm not getting rid of that book because I disliked it. After that, we have The Last Love Note. This one was a DNF, and I don't imagine myself necessarily giving this one a second chance. It's a love story, and it's supposed to be almost a rom-com feel where it's very silly, and the meet-cute is ridiculous, and I found it to be just a little too much. Certain things, it's just hard to strike the right balance for me. Certain things can be over-the-top absurd, and I love it. Other times, it just reads cringy for me. Everybody's cringe meter, we'll say, is different, so maybe other people won't feel that way, but it just wasn't going, it just right away I was like, no, not my cup of tea. After that, we have both Shadow of the Gods and Hunger of the Gods. So I have now gotten both of these in hardback, and I explained this in a book haul, but if you didn't see the long story short, I had a paperback of this one and eventually found a hardback of this one thinking, well, someday I'll find the hardback of this one. Have not been able to find a hardback of this one for less than $300. I'm like, I'm not going to pay $300 for just a hardback. No. So I've just kind of not had a matching set, which is fine. It's no big deal. But I saw someone selling both of them, Shadow of the Gods and Hunger of the Gods, a special edition with sprayed edges for cheaper than it would be for me to try and buy the first one as a hardback. And I was like, yeah, yes, please. So I went ahead and got those, and I'm going to, I think, take this one in as it's just the paperback edition. And then this one, which is signed by the author and a hardback, which I know is really hard to find. I know this firsthand because I've been hunting for them for a long time. I'm just probably going to sell this one on Pango, but again, for an affordable price, because I really don't like when people upsell for ridiculous prices. I understand if something is a special edition. I understand if it's really, really hard to find, something like that, or if it's a whole series and the whole series is a special edition. I do not get when it's just a hardback, though. After that, we have the only other one on the list that was actually a DNF, and that would be a DNF, excuse me, and that would be The Hurricane Wars. The writing style for me in this one just wasn't really working. It was kind of overwritten for my taste, meaning scenes that I would like to play out a certain way wouldn't really have the pace that I would prefer because it would stop to give us certain details that I found to be a little bit irrelevant in that moment. It's not that I'm opposed to a lot of detail or a lot of description, just the way in which those things were carried out wasn't quite to my liking. Also, it was, I mean, it feels like fan fiction, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but when I was already not quite connecting with the writing style, and then to have a story that is relatively familiar, I was just thinking that I, at the end of the day, probably wasn't ever going to be entirely gripped. I think anything that is a fan fiction or fan fiction leaning type of story, it is a harder sell for me, because even if I'm not entirely familiar with the original characters or the original story, I still, in my mind, I'm like, it's another person's work that, because I'm already somewhat familiar with it, I'm going to have certain expectations, kind of like retellings to an extent, because obviously it's a very similar concept. But also, I think there is a line for me where if you're going to do something that is somewhat inspired by something else, I really feel you have to deliver in the other areas, because either the characters are already there, the setting's already there, the plot's somewhat already there. So it's kind of my thing with adaptations as well. If you've already got so much of it present for you, where a lot of the creativity has already been established, then I want you to knock it out of the park in every other area. And that's what I mean by, since I wasn't really finding myself gripped by the writing, then I felt it was probably not ultimately going to be for me. However, this has worked for quite a few people. This is a beautiful, beautiful edition. So somebody, I'm sure, will be really happy to get their hands on this one. Speaking of being really happy, hopefully someone out there to get their hands on a special edition of a series, this last trilogy was part of a Broken Binding subscription. And I was originally considering rereading this series, but I had read the first one in the past and then decided to DNF the series. I didn't dislike it, I just didn't find it was one of my favorites that I couldn't wait to read the sequel, and with how many series are out there, I just found probably best for me to move to something that does fit my taste a little better. That said, when I got it as a Broken Binding set, I had started to think about, before I got it from Broken Binding, I was kind of thinking about it though. I kept finding myself being like, maybe. And then when I saw it was a Broken Binding, it was part of their subscription, and I got it, I was like, oh, this feels perfect. And that series would be I believe it's pronounced Lycanius trilogy. The first one is A Shadow of What Was Lost. These editions are great. They're hardcovers. They have the sprayed edges that go along with the prominent color on the cover. So obviously this first one we've got orange, so we have the orange sprayed edges. And the thing that's kept me from deciding to keep these ultimately is that I read The Will of the Many by this same author, and some of the similar things that kept me from really falling in love with that one were sort of the same sorts of things that kept me from falling in love with this trilogy. And I just figure, okay, maybe I'll continue on with The Will of the Many, but it also could be similar to what I talked about Adrienne Young's writing. I don't dislike the writing, it's just not something that seems to be clicking and aligning with my tastes and stories. And to kind of hit the same point I've hit a lot in this video, I'm sure somebody would love to get this whole trilogy special edition as it is. So figured best to not just have it sitting on my shelf and me contemplating if I want to give it another try or not. So anyway, that's it for this book unhaul. If any of these are ones that you're like, oh, I would love to have that set, hopefully either by the time this goes up or sometime in the future, I will have these up on Pango. The special edition ones, the ones I mentioned, likely I'd be selling as opposed to taking in. And if I don't end up doing it, or if you don't see it, it's possible somebody purchased it. So just want to throw that all out there. Also, I don't think Pango is international. So I'm sorry if you're an international person and you're like, I would love to get my hands on it. Anyway, though, that's it for this unhaul. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.